Welcome to the self-paced course on Theory of Change. This course aims to gain a clear understanding of the theory and principles underlying the approach, learn how to apply theory of change frameworks and methods to address complex social issues and drive meaningful change, gain the ability to critically examine and assess existing theory of change frameworks to identify strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. Learn how to adapt and refine theory of change models based on ongoing learning, feedback, and changing contexts. Explore ethical considerations and implications associated with the development and implementation of theory of change models. In Module 1, we will talk about theory of change, its genesis, types, and differences with various concepts which seems related to it. But first understand the important terminologies which seems similar like program theory, program logic model, logical framework approach, etc. A program theory is a concise and systematic representation of how a program is expected to work and achieve its desired outcomes. It serves as a roadmap for program planning, implementation, and evaluation, providing a clear understanding of the program's logic and assumptions. A program logic model is a visual representation or diagram that illustrates the logical connections between a program's inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. It provides a systematic and structured way to understand and communicate the program's theory of change. The logical framework approach is a structured project management tool used for planning, implementing, and monitoring projects. It consists of a logical framework that includes components such as the goal, purpose, outputs, activities, indicators, means of verification, and assumptions. Project implementation design refers to the process of translating the project plan into actionable steps, timelines, resource allocation, risk mitigation strategies, stakeholder engagement, and monitoring mechanisms to effectively execute the project and achieve its objectives. The theory of action is a conceptual framework that explains how specific actions or interventions lead to desired outcomes. It outlines the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact of a program or intervention. Let's delve deeper into the history of theory of change that can be traced back to the mid-20th century when it began to emerge as a concept in various fields. While there is no single definitive origin, several key milestones and influential figures have shaped its development over time. Here is a brief overview of the history of theory of change. Origins in program evaluation. The roots of theory of change can be found in the field of program evaluation, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. Evaluators recognized the need for a more comprehensive approach to understanding the theory and assumptions underlying interventions and their expected outcomes. Logical framework approach. In the 1970s, the logical framework approach, also known as log frame or log frame matrix, was developed within the context of international development projects. It provided a structured framework to plan, monitor, and evaluate interventions by identifying inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. The logical framework approach laid the foundation for later iterations of theory of change. Rethinking program evaluation. In the 1980s, scholars and practitioners in the evaluation field started questioning the limitations of traditional linear models of program evaluation. The focus shifted from assessing program activities and outputs to understanding the underlying theories of change and the complex causal relationships between interventions and outcomes. Early conceptualization. In the 1990s, theory of change began to take shape as a distinct concept. Influential figures like Carol Weiss and Michael Quinn Patton highlighted the need for evaluators to explicitly articulate the theories of change driving interventions and to assess their validity and effectiveness. Emergence of theory of change frameworks. During the 1990s and early 2000s, several organizations and institutions started developing their own theory of change frameworks and methodologies. The Aspen Institute, the Center for Theory of Change, and various philanthropic foundations played significant roles in advancing the theory and practice of theory of change. Increasing adoption and application. Over time, theory of change gained recognition and was increasingly adopted across sectors, including international development, social change initiatives, and non-profit organizations. Its popularity grew as a result of its ability to address complexity, support strategic planning, and enhance the effectiveness of interventions. Ongoing refinement and evolution. Theory of change continues to evolve and be refined as new insights, methodologies, and approaches emerge. Practitioners, evaluators, and researchers contribute to its development through sharing best practices, conducting case studies, and exploring its application in diverse contexts. Today, theory of change has become an established and widely used framework for planning, implementing, and evaluating social interventions. Its evolution reflects a growing recognition of the need for comprehensive and context-sensitive approaches to understanding and driving positive social change. Since we have understood the history of theory of change, let us now understand what it means. Theory of change is indeed a depiction of change that is informed by a deep understanding of the process that will lead to the desired change. It provides a roadmap or a theory for how activities and interventions will contribute to specific outcomes and ultimately achieve the intended impact. At its core, theory of change is built around a diagram or visual representation that illustrates the activities, outcomes, and causal relationships involved in the change process. This diagram helps to communicate and visualize the theory behind the change initiative. It provides a clear and logical framework for understanding how the activities undertaken by an organization or individual lead to specific changes and ultimately contribute to achieving the mission or vision. By using a theory of change approach, people and organizations can effectively communicate the relationship between their activities and the desired outcomes. It helps in breaking down the complex change process into manageable and understandable intermediate phases, allowing stakeholders to see the logical progression from inputs and activities to results. This enhances transparency, accountability, and alignment between the activities and the overall mission or vision of the organization. Furthermore, theory of change serves as a useful technique for planning, monitoring, and evaluating initiatives. It enables organizations to define and measure key milestones and outcomes along the change pathway, facilitating effective program management and assessment of progress. It helps identify critical assumptions and risks that need to be monitored and managed to ensure the success of the change efforts. Overall, theory of change is a valuable tool for organizations and individuals to conceptualize, communicate, and manage their change efforts. It brings clarity, coherence, and strategic focus to the process of achieving desired outcomes, ultimately leading to more impactful and effective interventions. It is important to understand the purpose of theory of change. Strategic planning. Theory of change helps organizations and stakeholders to develop a strategic roadmap by identifying the necessary steps and outcomes to achieve their goals. Program design and implementation. Theory of change guides the design and implementation of interventions by clarifying the logic of how activities and inputs lead to desired outcomes. Evaluation and learning. Theory of change provides a framework for evaluating the effectiveness and impact of interventions and supports learning by identifying assumptions and testing them. Now let's look at the theory of change model presented in a graphic form. This model outlines the immediate conditions as intended outcome in a causal framework or pathway. Theory of change can therefore be explained as assumptions about how direct interventions contribute to achieve project success. As you can see in the diagram, there are a series of boxes from the inputs to outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Developing a theory of change for an intervention enables us to identify where objectives and activities can be identified and tightly planned beforehand, or the changes and adaptations in response to emerging issues and to decisions made by partners and other stakeholders. For example, let's say the goal is to enhance economic independence and financial literacy among women in rural communities. The theory of change statement will be, if we provide entrepreneurship training, access to microfinance, and mentorship to Maya and Lena, women in rural communities, Maya and Lena will develop entrepreneurial skills, financial literacy, and business management capabilities through training, mentoring, and access to microloans. As a result, Maya and Lena will establish and grow their businesses, increase their income, and improve their economic well-being. This will lead to increased financial independence, improved decision-making power, and greater participation in community and household decision-making for them and other women in their communities. Ultimately, empowered women will contribute to poverty reduction, gender equality, and sustainable economic development in their communities. A theory of change typically exhibits several general features that contribute to its effectiveness as a planning and evaluation tool. It provides the big picture. A theory of change considers the broader context or environment in which the change is intended to occur. It acknowledges external factors and conditions that may influence the change process but are beyond the program's control. It includes multiple pathways. A theory of change recognizes that there can be multiple pathways or routes to achieve the desired change. It doesn't solely focus on the program's specific activities, but takes into account other factors and actors that may contribute to the desired outcomes. It explains how and why change happens. A theory of change goes beyond describing activities and outcomes. It delves into the underlying mechanisms, relationships, and assumptions that explain how and why change is expected to occur. It provides a causal narrative that connects inputs, activities, and outcomes. It completes the "if we do X, then Y will change because" statement. A theory of change allows for a clear articulation of the cause and effect relationship between program activities and desired outcomes. It completes the sentence by stating the expected change and the reasons behind it based on the program's logic. It can be presented as a diagram with narrative text. A theory of change is often represented visually through a diagram or graphic which captures the key elements and causal relationships. The diagram is complemented by narrative text that provides additional context, explanations, and supporting evidence. It has a flexible diagram format. The diagram in a theory of change is flexible and adaptable. It doesn't adhere to a specific format or structure, allowing for various configurations such as cyclical processes, feedback loops, multiple pathways, and different shapes. This flexibility accommodates the unique characteristics of each change initiative. It describes the rationale and evidence. A theory of change highlights the underlying assumptions and evidentiary basis for each link in the causal pathway. It distinguishes between assumptions that require further validation and assertions that are supported by existing evidence or research. This promotes transparency and critical thinking about the theory behind the change. Why do we need a theory of change? A theory of change is needed for several reasons. Developing a causal pathway. A theory of change allows us to establish a clear causal pathway that links inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and the overall goal. It helps identify the necessary and sufficient outcomes that need to be achieved to reach the desired goal. This systematic approach ensures that the program's activities are aligned with the intended outcomes. Creating a roadmap. A theory of change provides a roadmap or a strategic plan that outlines how a set of actions and interventions will lead to the desired change. It helps organizations and individuals understand the logical sequence of steps required to achieve their goals. This roadmap guides decision-making, resource allocation, and program implementation. Highlighting critical interventions and assumptions. A theory of change helps identify and highlight the interventions and assumptions that are critical to producing the intended outcomes. By explicitly stating the expected outcomes and the underlying assumptions, it enables stakeholders to critically examine the theory behind the change initiative. This promotes better understanding, transparency, and evaluation of the intervention's effectiveness. Addressing external actors and linkages. A theory of change also considers the external factors and actors that are relevant to the change process. It identifies the critical areas addressed by external actors and demonstrates how the project will link to them. This ensures that the program is well integrated into the broader context and takes into account the influences and contributions of other stakeholders. Advantages of a theory of change intervention. Clarity and focus. Theory of change provides a clear and structured framework for understanding and communicating the theory behind an intervention, enhancing clarity and focus. Alignment. Theory of change ensures alignment between activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, promoting coherence and effectiveness. Learning and reflection. Theory of change encourages continuous learning and reflection, fostering a culture of evidence-based decision-making and improvement. Stakeholder engagement. Theory of change promotes stakeholder engagement and collaboration, increasing the likelihood of buy-in, support, and sustainable change. Accountability. Theory of change helps organizations and stakeholders to be accountable for their actions and results by explicitly stating their expected outcomes and impact pathways. Limitations of a theory of change intervention. Complexity. Developing a comprehensive theory of change can be time-consuming and complex, requiring in-depth analysis, input from stakeholders, and ongoing revision. Uncertainty. Theory of change relies on assumptions about how change happens, which may not always be accurate. Unforeseen external factors or contextual changes can challenge the validity of the assumptions. Limited predictive power. While theory of change provides a logical framework, it cannot predict with certainty how external factors or interactions between variables will play out. Resource intensive. Implementing a theory of change intervention requires resources, including time, expertise, and data collection and analysis capabilities. Despite these limitations, theory of change remains a valuable tool for guiding interventions, fostering learning, and facilitating dialogue among stakeholders to promote effective and sustainable change. Types of theory of change. A theory of change is a tool that outlines the causal pathways through which an intervention or program is expected to achieve its intended outcomes. It helps to articulate the assumptions and logic underlying the intervention and provides a roadmap for understanding how change is expected to occur. Linear versus non-linear. Theory of change is a forecast that shows what conditions we believe must exist for other conditions to come into being. In a linear format of theory of change, as it is forward-looking and logical, it reflects the way we think logically, in a chronological order. Therefore, it can be helpful to complement theory of change with a process model that shows how the theory of change fits into a larger, more cyclical scheme in which theory leads to action, which leads to monitoring and evaluation, and so on. It assumes that by implementing specific activities, desired outputs are produced, which in turn lead to outcomes and ultimately result in impact. This linear approach implies a clear cause and effect relationship, often represented in a logical framework or flowchart. In terms of the nonlinear format of the theory of change, it refers to controlled randomness, which may be associated with recognizable and somewhat predictable problems. It is a discontinuous pathway depicted through challenges, interruptions, and a destabilizing of old patterns that requires multiple assessments over time and the examination of the individual trajectories of variables rather than group averages. Formative versus evaluative. Formative theory of change. It emphasizes learning and adaptation during the implementation of an intervention. It is developed in the early stages of program planning. It is used to help the program team understand the problem they are trying to solve, the target population, and the potential solutions. It provides a framework for ongoing reflection and refinement of the intervention strategy based on feedback and insights. It involves the key stakeholders in the development of the theory of change, which helps to ensure that the theory of change is accurate and relevant. Evaluation-focused theory of change focuses on assessing the impact and outcome of a program or intervention. It enables to evaluate whether the intended results have been achieved in a program. This type of theory of change is developed after the program has been implemented. It is used to assess the program's effectiveness and to identify the factors that contributed to its success or failure. It uses a variety of data sources to inform the theory of change, which ensures that it is comprehensive and accurate. Participatory versus adaptive versus transformational. Participatory theory of change is a collaborative approach that involves stakeholders in the development and evaluation of the program. This approach is often used in programs that work with marginalized or vulnerable populations, and it can be a helpful way to ensure that the program is responsive to the needs of the people it is intended to serve. Adaptive theory of change is an approach that recognizes that the world is constantly changing and that programs need to be able to adapt to these changes. This approach is often used in complex programs where there are multiple possible pathways to success. Adaptive theory of change can help to ensure that the program is able to adapt to changing circumstances and to continue to be effective. Transformational theory of change is an approach that seeks to bring about fundamental change in the way people think, act, or interact. This approach is often used in programs that address large-scale issues such as poverty, inequality, or environmental degradation. Transformational theory of change can be a long-term and challenging approach, but it can also be a powerful way to bring about lasting change. What is logical framework approach? The logical framework approach, often known as LFA, is a methodical and analytical process for managing and planning projects with a focus on objectives. It involves the following steps. Learn about the context. This step involves conducting a thorough analysis of the project's context, including understanding the social, economic, political, and cultural factors that may influence the project. This can be done by reading reports, books, studying maps, talking with experts, field visits, etc. Identify stakeholders. It is important to list the potential stakeholders and then to determine who will get priority when you start analyzing the problems. For example, is the view of the local authorities more important than that of the ministry? Is the view of the local NGOs more important than that of the local government? Problem tree analysis. You can use the problem tree analysis exercise to discover the various issues that people deal with, as well as the connections between those issues. The goal is to pinpoint the primary issue, determine what factors are the main contributors to it, and determine what secondary issues result from the primary issue. Objectives tree. Based on the problem tree analysis, develop an objectives tree that outlines the desired changes or outcomes. This entails starting at the top row of your problem tree and restating each card as a solution or a positive remark. It helps define the project's overall goal, specific objectives, and the logical relationship between them. The goal might at times have to be modified or clarified as before. The relationships between causes and effects must also be examined. Does the solution to problem A lead to the solution to problem B if problem A causes problem B? Take away any unattainable goals. The addition of objectives is periodically required. Choose the strategy. Determine the most appropriate strategy or approach to achieve the project's objectives. This involves considering different options and selecting the one that aligns with the project's context and resources. Formulate the log frame. The log frame is a key output of the LFA. It is a matrix that summarizes the project's components, including inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and indicators of success. The log frame provides a logical and structured representation of the project, helping to communicate the project design and guide implementation and monitoring. Verify the project's design. Review and validate the project's design with relevant stakeholders, ensuring that it is feasible, realistic, and aligned with the project's objectives and resources. This step involves seeking input, feedback, and consensus from key stakeholders to refine and finalize the project design. Theory of change and logical framework approach, also known as log frame, are two distinct frameworks used in program planning, implementation, and evaluation. Here are the key differences between theory of change and logical framework approach. Purpose and focus. Theory of change focuses on understanding and articulating the underlying theories and causal relationships that drive an intervention. It aims to provide a comprehensive and strategic view of how change happens, encompassing long-term outcomes and impacts. Theory of change emphasizes the need to clarify assumptions, address complexity, and align efforts towards desired social change. Logical framework approach is a more structured and operational framework that emphasizes the planning and management aspects of a program. It provides a logical framework matrix that outlines the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and indicators for monitoring and evaluation. Logical framework approach focuses on achieving specific and measurable results within a defined time frame. Complexity and context. Theory of change recognizes the complexity and contextual factors that influence social change. It encourages stakeholders to consider the broader system, interdependencies, and external influences when developing theories of change. Theory of change allows for a more flexible and adaptive approach to address complexity and adapt strategies as needed. Logical framework approach simplifies complexity by breaking down an intervention into manageable components and focusing on specific cause and effect relationships. It assumes a linear and predictable pathway of change, often overlooking the broader context and systemic factors that may influence outcomes. Time frame and flexibility. Theory of change typically takes a longer-term perspective, considering the time required for achieving sustainable social change. Theory of change allows for flexibility and adaptation over time, recognizing that the understanding of a problem and the effectiveness of intervention may evolve. Logical framework approach is designed for shorter-term planning and implementation, usually aligned with the duration of a program or project. It offers less flexibility and adaptation, as it often assumes a fixed and predefined sequence of activities and results. Stakeholder engagement. Theory of change emphasizes stakeholder engagement and participatory approaches. It encourages involving diverse stakeholders in the development of theories of change, fostering ownership, collaboration, and shared understanding. Logical framework approach may involve stakeholder consultation, but often places less emphasis on active stakeholder engagement. It is commonly developed by project managers or planners and shared with stakeholders for feedback or approval. What is theory of action? The theory of change is a comprehensive and overarching concept that outlines the pathway of how a program or intervention is expected to create desired outcomes or goals. It identifies the underlying assumptions, logic, and causal relationships between inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. It helps stakeholders understand the long-term vision and the step-by-step process required to achieve the intended change. The theory of change often encompasses various dimensions such as leadership, buy-in, political or social change, and behavior change, which are considered important outcomes or goals of the program. The theory of action, sometimes referred to as the logic of action or theory of action model, focuses on the sequence and relationship between key components of a program: inputs, activities, and outputs. It outlines how inputs are utilized through specific activities or interventions to produce desired outputs. The theory of action emphasizes the immediate and direct results or products of the program's implementation. It highlights the cause and effect relationships between inputs, activities, and outputs, providing a clear logic of how the program is expected to work at an operational level. Unlike the theory of change, the theory of action does not explicitly address long-term outcomes or impacts, but focuses more on the immediate results of program implementation. There is a distinction between theory of change and theory of action, although they share some similarities. Here are the key differences between the two. Focus and scope. Theory of change emphasizes a broader perspective and encompasses the entire chain of cause and effect relationships to achieve social outcomes. It looks at the underlying assumptions, causal pathways, and long-term impacts, considering both intended and unintended consequences of an intervention. Theory of action focuses on the immediate actions and steps needed to achieve a specific goal or objective. It looks at the sequence of actions required to produce desired outcomes and often focuses on shorter-term results rather than long-term impacts. Time frame. Theory of change typically takes a longer-term view, looking at the long-term outcomes and impacts that an intervention aims to achieve. It considers the complexity and time required to bring about meaningful social change. Theory of action tends to have a more immediate time frame and focuses on the near-term actions and results necessary for achieving specific objectives within a shorter time frame. Flexibility and adaptability. Theory of change allows for greater flexibility and adaptability over time. It recognizes that the understanding of a complex social problem and the effectiveness of interventions may evolve, and theory of change models can be revised and refined based on ongoing learning and feedback. Theory of action is relatively fixed and less flexible. It outlines a more concrete and specific set of actions required to achieve a goal or objective, with less room for adaptation or adjustment. Complexity and context. Theory of change acknowledges and addresses the complexity of social problems and their solutions. It considers the interdependencies, multiple factors, and contextual influences that contribute to change. Theory of action is often more straightforward and focuses on a specific intervention or program. It may not fully account for the broader context or systemic factors that can influence outcomes. While theory of change and theory of action have differences, they can also be complementary. Theory of change provides a broader strategic framework for understanding the overall theory and assumptions behind an intervention, while theory of action provides a more focused and operational plan for executing specific actions. Both approaches can be used in combination to enhance program design, implementation, and evaluation. What is program implementation design? The steps for program implementation design can vary depending on the specific context and nature of the program. However, following are the key steps that need to be taken care of. Understand the context for programming. Begin by conducting a thorough analysis of the context in which the program will be implemented. This includes considering the social, cultural, economic, and political factors that may impact the program. Identify the needs, challenges, and opportunities that exist in the target population or area of focus. Conceptualize the change. Clearly define the desired change or outcomes that the program aims to achieve. This involves setting specific goals and objectives that align with the identified needs and priorities. Consider the long-term vision and the short-term milestones that will indicate progress towards the desired change. Design educational, organizational, and evaluative approaches. Develop a comprehensive program design that outlines the strategies, activities, and interventions that will be implemented to achieve the desired change. Determine the educational methods, training programs, or capacity building initiatives that will be utilized. Consider the organizational structure, staffing requirements, and coordination mechanisms necessary for effective implementation. Additionally, design the evaluation framework and methods to measure and assess the program's impact. Implement the program or organizational effort. Put the program design into action by initiating the planned activities and interventions. Allocate resources, establish timelines, and assign responsibilities to ensure smooth execution. Monitor progress, provide support and guidance to program staff, and address any challenges or issues that arise during implementation. Evolve the effort through reflection and learning. Continuously monitor and evaluate the program's progress and outcomes. Regularly reflect on the effectiveness of the implemented strategies and activities. Use the feedback and data collected to make informed decisions and adjustments to improve the program's impact. Foster a learning culture within the organization, encouraging ongoing reflection, adaptation, and innovation based on evidence and stakeholder feedback. Theory of change and program implementation design are both approaches used in the development and implementation of social interventions, but they have distinct purposes and focus areas. Here are the key differences between the two. Purpose. The purpose of a theory of change is to provide a strategic roadmap for achieving desired social outcomes. It focuses on articulating the underlying assumptions, causal pathways, and logic of how an intervention is expected to bring about change. The purpose of program implementation design is to create a detailed plan for executing a specific program or project. It focuses on operational considerations such as the defining activities, setting timelines, allocating resources, and establishing monitoring and evaluation frameworks. Scope. Theory of change takes a broader and more holistic perspective. It looks beyond the immediate activities and outputs to encompass the entire chain of cause and effect relationships, including short-term outcomes, long-term impacts, and contextual factors. Program implementation design is narrower in scope and primarily focuses on the practical aspects of implementing a specific program. It outlines the specific steps, tasks, and activities required to achieve the desired outcomes. Time frame. Theory of change typically takes a long time perspective, looking at the expected outcomes and impacts over an extended period. It considers the complexity and interdependencies involved in achieving lasting social change. Program implementation design focuses on planning and executing activities within a specific time frame, often aligned with the duration of the program or project. Flexibility. Theory of change allows for greater flexibility and adaptability. It recognizes that the understanding of a complex social problem and the effectiveness of interventions may evolve over time. Theory of change models can be revised and refined based on ongoing learning and feedback. Program implementation design is more concrete and fixed. It involves detailed planning and sets specific targets, activities, and outputs. While adjustment can be made during the implementation, the overall design remains relatively stable.